So good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's talk through Humanists Australia. We're very pleased to have you all along and thrilled to be joined by Allan, who is known to many of you. We'll introduce him properly in just a few minutes. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about humanism. You probably already know some of this background, but just to provide a context, humanism can be described as a democratic and ethical life stance that affirms that human beings have the right and responsibility to give meaning and shape to their own lives. I wanted to just say a little bit about Humanists Australia. Humanists Australia is a national organisation which was launched almost 4 years ago in December 2020 in response to the growing number of Australians who don't identify as religious and the emerging need to represent the interests of this group and the priorities of this group on a broader scale. Humanists Australia is dedicated to helping people live ethical and meaningful lives through humanism. Through our ceremonies, educational resources, and awareness raising, we help non-religious people discover humanism and humanist values so that they can live an ethical life full of meaning and fulfillment. Liz's talk tonight, I think you will find, picks up on these themes as to what is humanism and the vision and the aims of Humanists Australia rather beautifully. I will just, for your background and for anybody who's listening to this recording afterwards, just provide the details on what Liz is talking about, so we have the context clearly in mind when I introduce Les and he starts addressing us this evening. So Leslie Allan will talk tonight on humanism, morality without God. Some theologians claim that if God did not exist, there would be no grounding for our moral judgments. Leslie Allan presents a humanist view that challenges the presumption that moral objectivity consists in tapping into a realm of human independent facts. He endeavours to show that moral judgments are expressions of human preferences taken from an impartial standpoint, leaving no room for a deity. Following the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for questions and discussion. I'll just tell you a little bit about Leslie Allan. He is academically trained in philosophy and history of religions at Trobe University. In his working life, Leslie's career spanned electronics, information technology, training and development, and business improvement. Over the years, he has authored many articles and given various talks on humanism, ethics, religion, and philosophy. In 2018, Leslie started up Australia's first ex-religious support network. Twice, he served as Vice President for Humanists Victoria and currently sits on the Board of Humanists Australia. He also runs the Philosophy Matters Meetup and is owner of rationalrealm.com, a website dedicated to exploring the boundaries between science and philosophy. It is my great pleasure, and I'm sure you'll all join me in inviting Les to speak to us on tonight's topic. Thank you, Les.
Oh, thanks for that introduction, Akiva, and it's great to see you all tonight. I'm pleased to see quite a good number here. So by way of introduction, at university I debated with religious folk who were impressing on me that without God there is no morality. Without God all there is the exercise of raw power, they would say. What depressed me was the number of atheists and naturalists I spoke with who went along with this supposition. Unfortunately, many naturalists and atheists think that a scientific worldview entails that morality is either a fiction or that moral judgments are nothing more than the subjective expression of a person's or cultural group's preferences. A key part of the humanist worldview is that morality is both real and objective, even when there is no God and we are guided by science. Today, I want to show how, as humanists, we can defend that view of moral objectivity. But first, let me clarify my terms. By atheist, I mean a person who does not believe that a God or God exists. For simplicity in this talk, when I say atheist, I mean atheist and agnostic. By agnostic, I mean a person who either thinks it's impossible for anyone to know whether a God or God exists, or thinks only that they personally do not know whether a God or gods exist. By naturalist, and it's a term I use a fair bit tonight, by naturalist, I mean a person who thinks there are no supernatural entities or forces, that all that exists is natural. And by humanist, I mean secular humanist. That is, I mean a naturalist who values reason and evidence, promotes compassion and equality, and affords dignity and respect for everyone. Okay, key ideas for tonight. An essential part of the humanist moral outlook is that there are universal human values. Second thing is I want to bring across is that in the face of religious polemics, counting ourselves as subjectivists or relativists puts us at a significant social and political disadvantage. Third, trying to ground ethics in God's commands or our God-given nature is a failed enterprise. Fourth idea, the essence of morality rests in our ability to think impartially beyond our parochial concerns. And last key thing I want to get across is that humanism provides a rich source of ideas on how to be morally objective. So a central feature of the humanist philosophy the world over is our reliance on reason and evidence. Hence, we respect the scientific method and the picture of the world presented by scientists. Another key feature of humanism is promoting a set of universal moral values that is independent of religion. And here are some examples. From the American Humanist Association, who brought out Humanist Manifesto version 3, they say humanists ground values in human welfare shaped by human circumstances, interests and concerns, and extended to the global ecosystem and beyond. Humanists International just recently redrafted their International Amsterdam Declaration, and in there it says that we accept that morality is inherent to the human condition, grounded in the ability of living things to suffer and flourish, motivated by the benefits of helping and not harming, enabled by reason and compassion, and needing no source outside of humanity. And then finally, with our own Humanists Australia, on our What is Humanism page, we say this: humanism is ethical and rational and supports democracy and human rights. Humanism recognises that humans have naturally evolved value sets as well as cultural ones. Ethics is the process of refining our values and determining how to act in line with those values. So clearly, the humanist philosophy is not a kind of nihilism that rejects all notions of moral values. And this philosophy does not regard ethics as subjective, merely the personal preferences of each individual. And it does not seem to be relativistic either, basing fundamental moral norms on whichever culture or society you happen to live in. Humanism appeals to some enduring values, including human rights, that appear to be universal. Most importantly, there is no appeal to some divine lawgiver or some natural law enshrined in us by God. But now we have a problem. How do we as humanists and atheists defend an objective notion of ethics in the face of full frontal attacks by religious leaders and theologians? Why should this matter to us anyway? Can't we be content with just accepting the subjective or relative nature of ethics? Why should the question of objectivity in ethics matter to us as humanists and atheists? Well, because I think that resting on the notion that morality is subjective or relative weakens our influence in the social and political arena. Thinking this way exposes a soft underbelly that is attacked gleefully by the religious. Humanists as atheists want to campaign for a woman's right to an abortion, against blasphemy laws, for the right to a peaceful death, against gross inequalities in wealth, and so on. But by arguing that morality is just a matter of taste or culture, we lose the high moral ground. Our opponents can and do claim that we have no legitimate place in the public sphere of social and political discourse. Here are just 3 examples of why humanists ought to worry. Writing in the Huffington Post, well-known Christian philosopher, probably the most well-known worldwide, William Lane Craig, had this to say about ethics without God. In a world without God, there can be no objective right and wrong, only our culturally and personally relative subjective judgments. This means that it is impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil, nor can one praise brotherhood, equality, and love as good. For in a universe without God, good and evil do not exist. There is only the bare, valueless fact of existence, and there is no one to say you are right and I am wrong. Next, take the famous Christian apologist C.S. Lewis. In his book, Christian Reflections, he addresses the subjectivist moral indignation against the Axis powers during World War II. He objects that, quote, "This indignation is perfectly groundless if we ourselves regard morality as a subjective sentiment to be altered at will, unless there is some objective standard of good overarching Germans, Japanese, and ourselves alike, whether any of us obey it or no, then of course the Germans are as competent to create their ideology as we are to create ours." As my final example, listen to Pastor Rick Henderson's full frontal attack on the moral integrity of atheists. He says, a good atheist, that is, a consistent atheist, recognises this dilemma. His only reasonable conclusion is to reject objective meaning and morality. Thus, calling him good in the moral sense is nonsensical. There is no morally good atheist because there really is no objective morality. At best, morality is the mass delusion shared by humanity, protecting us from the cold sting of despair. I think these examples show that contenting ourselves with ethical subjectivism or relativism gives far too much ground to the religious. Adopting this label only confirms for them that all humanists and atheists are at bottom nihilists and egotists. When you call yourself a subjectivist or a relativist, I think you convey the impression to the public as well that you think that moral preferences are just about what you want or what your cultural group want. What I want to do now is dig a little deeper into this question and show you a way for humanists and atheists to ground our moral judgments objectively. Now, this is not the only way open to humanists and other non-religious. However, I think it's the best way to ward off the objections of the religious and to actually show how their own method for grounding ethics in God is indefensible. I want to start by examining the moral subjectivist notion that when we make a moral judgment, we're doing nothing more than expressing or describing our personal preference. So on this account, saying charity is good is the same kind of judgment as saying that dress looks good. On this view, ultimately, moral judgments just come down to the personal taste of the speaker. Now, what I say here can be adjusted without too much modification to the case of the relativists. In the latter case, what is being appealed to is a preference of a group of individuals, a cultural group. So picture this scene. 4 friends are sitting around the coffee table arguing over a moral question that is still very much in the news, voluntary assisted dying. They're discussing whether people enduring unbearable pain much of the time while suffering a terminal illness ought to be able to end their lives as they choose. Now, Fred says, quote, "The terminally ill ought to have that right, as people have a right to act autonomously unless the act harms someone else." Now, Mary objects. She says, "The terminally ill ought not, as instituting such a right will lead to abuse with some elderly coerced into ending their lives." Now, John says boldly, quote, "The terminally ill should be prevented from choosing the manner of their death." Now, Fred and Mary ask John why he thinks so. And after a brief pause, John replies, I just like it that way. And Fred and Mary press John further. Why do you want to prevent people from choosing how they die? John pushes back, simply insisting, that is just what I want. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and ask you to reflect on what you think of John's contribution to the moral discussion. Now, please note, I'm not asking whether you think John's conclusion is right or wrong, but about his style of reasoning for his conclusion, about the nature of his contribution. I want to propose that Fred and Mary are offering a moral reason for their judgment. Their reasons are based on considerations broader than their own personal wants and preferences. Now, of course, we may disagree with one or more of, or both of their justifications, but I think it's natural to say that they are advancing a moral argument. Now, regarding John, however, I propose that he's not offering a moral reason for his judgment at all. By exclusively appealing to his own personal preferences, he seems not to have engaged in the moral debate at all. He may be advancing a prudential reason for his view. That's good for me. However, I think it's natural to insist that he's not putting forward a moral justification for his position. His stated reason is outside the bounds of moral discourse. Now, I think this scenario shows that for a reason to be a moral reason for action, we expect it to be impartial, without appeal to the speaker's peculiar interests or the interests of their favoured group. We think people who give a partial or selfish reason for a moral judgment has been conceptually confused about what constitutes a moral reason for action. This requirement for impartiality, I want to say, is built into the very concept of morality. Most moral philosophers down the ages have felt that morality is objective in some sense, and here they are in agreement with the person on the street. However, in their attempt to explain this sense of objectivity, some philosophers and most theologians have been looking for this objectivity in the wrong place. They've been looking for it in some otherworldly realm, outside of human thought and desires. And this is what contrasts them with humanist philosophers who reject a divine realm and a belief in the supernatural. I think this kind of anti-naturalist project has failed. Here are 4 prominent examples. So the first one is the intuitionist, which was quite popular in moral philosophy from the 1940s. And George Moore, was one of the, if not that leading proponent of this intuitionist view. So on this view, I think they mistakenly conflate moral attributes with some mysterious realm of non-natural properties and transcendent rules. On this view, the goodness of giving to the poor, for example, is as much a part of the objective properties of the act as to how much money was given and who it was given to. Now, I'm not going to go into these views in any detail. If you want to ask about a little bit more detail at the end, I'm happy to do that. But I'm just putting these forward as some prominent examples of projects that I think have been barking up the wrong tree. So the next one, Immanuel Kant, extremely prominent Enlightenment philosopher in quite a number of areas. And then the people who followed him, the Kantian rationalists, his view was called rationalism in moral theory. The Kantian rationalists try to derive moral rules from the demands of pure reason. According to Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, we should act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. Thirdly, the religious natural law theorists and the religious virtue ethicists. I say religious because there are non-religious versions of natural law theory and virtue ethics. But these religious versions rely on a dubious teleology of humankind's development to what the divine wants from us. For these people, we act morally when we act according to our God-created innate natures, natures that allow us to fulfill our divine purpose. And then lastly, the divine command theorists, great proponent, probably the first great proponent, Augustine, in around about the year 400. So the divine command theorists try to identify the good and the right with God's preferences and commands. On this view, to say that something is good is just to say that God approves it. Now, as I said, I'm not going to walk through these non-humanist philosophical traditions. I mean, that could be the subject of another talk. Today, I will only say something about divine command theory, as a key purpose of this talk is to show how God's existence can't ground the objectivity we find in ethical reasoning. What I will say in summary is that I think the mistake in all four of these non-naturalist positions is the idea that objectivity in ethics is about some otherworldly or some other than human dimension. For them, this objective aspect of morality has nothing to do with human wants and preferences. Their mistake is in thinking that ethics is objective only in this sense, that ethics is about human independent facts that are there to be discovered and known. So what's wrong with divine command theory as a way of objectively grounding ethics in God's commands? The major problem with divine command theory is exposed by what's called the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, the name of this dilemma is inspired by Socrates' question to Plato's character Euthyphro in Plato's play of the same name. In this play, Socrates asks Euthyphro, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Now, in today's language, we can express this question as, does God love the good because it is good, or is it good because God loves it? In trying to answer this question, divine command theorists are placed on the horns of a dilemma. And I illustrate this dilemma with this diagram. The first horn is illustrated in the top row, while the second horn is shown in the bottom row. On which horn ought the God believer settle on sitting? Consider first sitting on the first horn. If God loves the good because it is good, then, as my diagram illustrates, goodness must be independent of God's wishes. The good is good for some reason other than God wanting it. And as I've got there in the top row, on this option, God loves the good because it is good, then by implication, morality is independent of God. This option then conflicts starkly with the central premise of divine command theory. On this option, William Lane Craig's, C.S. Lewis's and Rick Henderson's God is now done out of a job. At most, God is simply a law transmitter and not a law giver. What if the God believer sits on the second horn? If the good is good because God loves it, then to say God is good is just to say that God is loved by God. This is true, but it's trivially true. It says nothing of moral significance. It also makes morality entirely arbitrary. Now, that's the punchline in my diagram. So in that second row, the second horn, the option, the good is good because God loves it, then by implication, morality is arbitrary. God could have commanded genocide or the taking of sex slaves, and then this would have been good. This divine capriciousness is what we actually find told in the Old Testament. However, our intuitions tell us that what is fundamentally good and right today was good and right yesterday and will be good and right tomorrow. Taking this horn of the dilemma reduces divine command theory to the worst forms of subjectivism and relativism, a charge that theologians have levelled consistently at the non-religious, including humanists. Think back to William Lane Craig's, C.S. Lewis's, and Rick Henderson's critique of non-religious ethics that I quoted earlier. Now, there are certain ways that God believers have tried to get around these unpalatable conclusions. I think their responses don't do the job. However, that's a discussion for another time. Now, let me illustrate this superfluity of religion in our moral considerations with a story. Imagine for a moment all of you here are going on a holiday by sea. Your ship becomes stranded on a desert island with none of the crew surviving. You're left with some food, materials to make some shelter, and the natural resources on the island. To survive individually and as a group, what rules would you make to govern your behaviour? Would you decide on the rule, kill your fellow survivors when you can get away with it? Would you choose steal from the food store when no one is looking? Would you decide on break your promises when you can't be bothered keeping them? Of course, the answer is obvious when you think about it. See, for a humanist, there's nothing mysterious or out of this world about the moral rules that we want others to live by. They are simply the rules that we must all conform to if we are to get the mutual benefits of cooperation for us to survive and to thrive. So that's divine command theory. The fundamental mistake here it shares with the other three non-naturalist theories I mentioned, intuitionism, Kantianism, natural law theory, is that it's looking for objectivity in ethics in some human independent realm divorced from human preferences. As a humanist, you'd be thinking, if there's no divine or supernatural realm, ethics must have something to do with human thoughts and feelings. And you're right. What these four non-naturalist approaches are ignoring is what is called the expressive function of moral language. When we say, for example, that charity is good, we're not simply describing the act of charity, just giving it one more attribute or an attribute. We're also expressing our preference or our pro-attitude to charity. We are commending acting charitably to our listeners. So to illustrate this expressive function, think for a moment about someone who says, charity is good, yeah, but I don't really care for it one way or the other. Or someone who says, torturing innocent children for fun is abominably bad, but I'm not really fussed about it. These kinds of statements seem extremely odd. We feel that they've expressed some kind of practical contradiction. And that's because that in saying that something is good or bad, we are expressing our preference or our aversion to it. The key insight here is that in making moral judgments, we're not simply describing or stating facts about the situation. There are many evaluative words such as these in the English language that have this central expressive meaning, such as hero and villain, chaste and prude, patriot and traitor. Notice how the one person or the one act can be described in the completely opposite fashion, depending on whether the speaker is morally for or against the person or action. Now, take the attack on the United States Capitol building on 7th of January 2021 and the people who led the attack. Whether you judge them as patriots or traitors depends on whether you personally commend or denounce their actions. So the religious approach, along with the other three non-naturalist moral theories I mentioned, misses this important insight that in making moral judgments, we are expressing our preferences. But it's not just any kind of preference of ours that counts as a moral judgment. Humanists also know that morality is not just about what we like or personally prefer. There's much more to saying torturing children is morally abominable than just expressing our dislike or disapproval of such torture. Our scenario with Fred, Mary, and John discussing the pros and cons of voluntary assisted dying concretely brings this point home. That extra dimension that constrains the type of subjective preferences that count as moral judgments is, I suggest, that objective dimension in ethics we've been looking for. So contra those four moral theories I mentioned, objectivity and moral reasoning is not about tapping into some world of human independent facts. Objectivity in ethics is about being impartial, about taking a view that is beyond our own personal wants and parochial concerns. That's the kind of partisan subjectivity we put aside when we reason about how we ought to act. Think again of the inappropriateness of John's response in our scenario. There, John gave an answer wholly based on his personal preference and on nothing else outside of him. To illustrate this distinction between objective reasoning in ethics and subjective bias, think about our tax obligations. So in considering our nation's tax policy, we want our representatives to take the morally objective stance of considering all interests impartially. We criticise a politician morally when they have their snouts in the trough, proposing a policy designed surreptitiously to advantage them, their family and their mates. It's this kind of partisan subjective policy formation that we denounce as being immoral. Some religious may think that I have misappropriated the word objective to suit my own philosophical position. Let me point out that all of the major dictionaries list one of two central meanings of the term as impartial and unbiased. So here I can point you to the British Dictionary, for example, or the Penguin Macquarie Dictionary, or the Merriam-Webster's Dictionary. So just to quote that last one, the Merriam-Webster's Dictionary, it gives this sense of objective: fair, just, equitable, impartial, unbiased, dispassionate, objective, mean free from favour toward either or any side. Objective stresses a tendency to view events or persons as apart from oneself and one's own interest or feelings. It gives an example. I can't be an objective about my own child. It's precisely in this sense that our laws are held to the ideal of being applied objectively. Consider Our Lady Justice, who sits outside many of our courthouses. Notice how she sports a blindfold. Now, Wikipedia has a good summary of what that blindfold represents. And quoting Wikipedia, the blindfold represents objectivity in that justice is or should be meted out objectively, without fear or favour, regardless of money, wealth, fame, power, or identity, blind justice and impartiality. Now, a dominant theme coming out of Enlightenment thinking in moral philosophy is this notion of impartiality as the key objective requirement for moral discourse. Now, this is not a new idea. This insight from disparate Enlightenment thinkers marked a decisive turning point from earlier scholastic thought in the Middle Ages, in Middle Ages Europe. Here are 6 prominent examples of this strong universalist tradition in moral philosophy. Now, this list will include both humanist and non-humanist thinkers. So David Hume is considered a preeminent humanist from this Enlightenment period. Now, one of his moral theories, he had a couple. He was also considered a utilitarian, but he also advocated for this what's called an ideal observer theory. So for Hume, when we make moral judgments, we are trying to stand in the shoes of a dispassionate observer without regard for self and our particular social group. Even though our judgments are fundamentally based on sentiment, that is, personal feelings, according to Hume, they are formulated from what he called a general point of view. Henry Sidgwick, another very, very prominent moral philosopher in this period, writing some 100 years later after Hume, called this the point of view of the universe. So that's the first example of this view of impartiality from a naturalist standpoint, naturalist humanist standpoint. Oh, sorry, not from what am I talking about? From this Enlightenment period, bringing out quite strongly for the first time in moral philosophy this notion that impartiality is at the centre of what it is to make a moral judgment. Now, Immanuel Kant, we've already met him with his categorical imperative. Kant stood in opposition to the humanists of his day. Even so, Kant tried to capture this idea of universality in his categorical imperative. This was his notion that a moral rule necessarily must be such that it is willed for all, that it be universally applied without exception. Along with Hume, Jeremy Bentham is a famous humanist moral philosopher of the Enlightenment. He was one of the three, what are called the classical utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sidgwick. With other prominent utilitarians of the period, he encapsulated moral objectivity with his what's called the principle of impartiality. This famous principle is translated as a requirement for the equal consideration of all interests. Actually, that's not quite true. It's the equal consideration of equal interests, no matter who it is that has those interests. So moving now to the modern period, Richard Hare, who was a professor that Peter Singer learned under. So in this modern period, along with humanists, Richard Hare is a naturalist. He built into his theory that's of universal prescriptivism, that's the name of the theory, prescriptivism, the idea that moral judgments are prescriptions that we want to apply to everyone. John Rawls, well noted as the most preeminent, prominent political philosopher in the 20th century. So refining the work of earlier Enlightenment social constructivists such as Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Rawls put the requirement for impartiality at the centre of his view of the social contract. For Rawls, our political norms are rules agreed upon by actors communicating behind what he called a veil of ignorance about one's wealth, gender, nationality, etc. A last example, Massimo Pigliucci, a recent proponent of a modern-day proponent of Stoic cosmopolitanism, drawing on the work of earlier Stoics such as Zeno and Epictetus, Pigliucci emphasised how in using reason we realise that our parochial concerns are neither more nor less important than those of everyone else. Now, what is striking is that all six of these dominant moral theories require no special divine or supernatural ingredient to explain how ethics is objective. They all appeal to impartiality as central in one way or another. Now, as a humanist, whichever way you want to go in fleshing out what impartiality means, you have serious humanist thinkers you can draw upon. You can appeal to David Hume's idea that correct moral judgments are those made by an idealised impartial observer. In that centre pane, Jeremy Bentham is but one of a long line of humanist thinkers who argued for this is colloquial, the greatest happiness of the greatest number principle. I say it's colloquial because some people completely misconstrue it, and actually it's not an accurate construal, not an accurate construal of the central thing of utilitarianism. So I use it with caution because some people think it's a majority rule when it's absolutely not. Now, Bentham, along with John Stuart Mill, was a great moral reformer of the Enlightenment, advocating, for example, for animal rights, women's rights, and penal reform. In this day, humanist professor Peter Singer carries on that tradition of moral advancement. Peter Singer was recognised as Australian Humanist of the Year in 2004 and awarded the Berggruen Prize for Philosophy and Culture in 2021. He is considered by many as the world's most influential living philosopher. So you can draw on this long and respected humanist utilitarian tradition of seeing moral impartiality as the equal consideration of all interests, irrespective of a person's identity or characteristics. An equally long-standing and respected tradition in humanist and moral philosophy is social contract theory. John Rawls's work is often cited in humanist publications. You can rely on Rawls's idea that we approach impartiality in our moral judgments when we strip away the particularities of our social class, gender, religion, and so on. A tradition not so often cited in humanist circles is Stoic cosmopolitanism. However, there are some thoughtful humanists who have developed a humanist form of cosmopolitanism. The humanist John Shook is a case in point. You can accept his notion that impartiality consists in seeing ourselves as world citizens, being respected and respecting other cultures, irrespective of a person's nationality and religion. So, as a humanist, you have plenty of resources and a rich historical and philosophical tradition from which to build an objective ethic that lays aside notions of divine will and God-created law. So, armed with our philosophical resources, let's return to our earlier religious objectors who insisted there can be no objective morality without God. I think we can now answer them directly. Recall Christian philosopher William Lane Craig wrote this about ethics without God. In a world without God, there can be no objective right and wrong, only our culturally and personally relative subjective judgments. So to William Lane Craig, we can now answer that even without God, we can appeal to something outside of our culturally and personally relative subjective judgments. Next, we saw how C.S. Lewis rightly objected to the subjectivist moral indignation against the Axis powers during the Second World War, when he wrote that, quote, "This indignation is perfectly groundless if we ourselves regard morality as subjective sentiment to be altered at will. Unless there is some objective standard of good overarching Germans, Japanese, and ourselves alike, then of course the Germans are as competent to create their ideology as we are to create ours." To this Christian apologist, we can point out that moral objectivity requires precisely forgetting our nationality. That's part of what it means to make a moral judgment. We don't need a God to be able to think impartially. That the nations of the world came together following the horrors of the Second World War to sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a testament to our ability as humans to transcend our national and religious identities. Finally, recall how Pastor Rick Henderson attacked the moral integrity of atheists on these grounds. A good atheist, that is, a consistent atheist, recognises this dilemma. His only reasonable conclusion is to reject objective meaning and morality. At best, morality is the mass delusion shared by humanity, protecting us from the cold sting of despair. End of quote. To Rick Henderson, we can point out that an atheist has other cards up their sleeve. Our ability to think impartially in matters of morality is not some mass delusion. In fact, adopting a non-partisan attitude is the cornerstone of taking a moral stance with or without a God. For all three of our religious authors, it's difficult to see how adding one more conscious, desiring, and willing agent, God, to the mix of people grappling with moral questions can help us being more objective. By their own account, that's just adding one more subjective opinion. But, they will say, God is supremely knowing and powerful. But so what? Possessing superior knowledge and power is no guarantee of having a moral sense. Plato's Euthyphro dilemma taught us that. Using the God believers' reasoning, the superior knowledge and power of a cotton plantation owner in the Deep South 2 centuries ago would guarantee the moral permissibility of owning slaves. We also now have the armory for exposing what's morally pernicious about the God believers' own holy texts. The genocidal tribalism, the misogyny, the homophobia, the murder of millions of innocent children during Noah's flood, the ritual sacrifice of animals on an industrial scale. These are all conspicuously wrong because they discount the interests of one class in preference to another. We don't need some supposed God to tell us these actions are wrong, as many religious who are now late coming to the party are now insisting. Persecution of and discrimination against feeling beings because they don't belong to your preferred class contravenes the basic requirement for impartiality of judgment, even when this persecution and discrimination is modelled by or commanded by God. The kind of naturalist and humanist conception of morality I've been promoting here, I think, shows up the parochial religious sentiments as thoroughly misguided. When you're challenged to say more about how impartiality translates into making real-world moral decisions, you can lean on one or more of the 3 humanist moral theories I mentioned: social contract theory, cosmopolitanism, and utilitarianism. For example, you can use the utilitarian approach by impartially weighing the interests, pains, and sufferings of slaves on the one hand and of their masters on the other, to reject outright as immoral the kinds of laws mandating and regulating the ownership of one human being by another, given in Leviticus and Exodus and reaffirmed in the New Testament. You could also appeal to John Rawls's social contract theory in showing how the subjugation of women in the Bible is immoral. You could explain how rational and impartial moral agents situated behind Rawls's veil of ignorance, in which they don't know their sex, their marital status, their religion, and their social class, would outright reject the kinds of institutions and laws that preference males over females. The good news is that this concept of objectivity in ethics as consisting of impartial consideration can be found in the thinking of the founders of the major religions of the world. In many religions, God is seen as the impartial judge. Now, I've got 3 examples there: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I'm not going to go through those examples. You can have a look in the slides when they're put up. But I do want you to note how in these 3 religions, with these examples, these particular examples, dispensing justice is about the nature of the deeds done, untainted by consideration of the judged person's particulars, for example, their gender, their heritage, ethnic origin, position in society. The Golden Rule is another excellent example of how this requirement for impartiality is embedded into our most central moral maxims. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is the maxim expressed by all of the major religious and non-religious worldviews when they are at their noblest. We can find the maximum of the Golden Rule going back to the most ancient of civilizations, and I've listed 6 there. We can also find the Golden Rule expressed in these more modern religions, and I've listed 5 there with some sources. The Wikipedia entry on the Golden Rule gives a good overview of how the various religions incorporate this universalist moral rule. Now, Scarborough Missions has produced a wonderful poster that you can download that illustrates well this commonality of the Golden Rule to all of these different worldviews. Here is the printed poster that I picked up when I went to a seminar quite a while ago. I think it was a seminar, symposium, and you can download and print that out in A4. Now, note how this universalist maxim makes no reference to God and is intuitively compelling as a way of guiding action for people of widely varying cultures and times. If you're going to expect others to consider your interests, then treat them with the same consideration. How can you expect any different? In dealing with others, your interests do not count for any more or less just because of who you are. For all of these key philosophical and religious traditions, this is the principle of impartiality that is at the core of what it means to act morally. And here is my key message today. This requirement to think impartially is what gives moral discourse its objective flavour, whichever religious, atheist, or naturalist dish it is served in. So, to wrap up, tonight I've indicated how objectivity in ethics is important for humanists, especially in combating attacks by religious opponents. I went on to show how a humanist can make sense of moral objectivity without appealing to some divine realm. I pointed to the problems with divine command theory using Plato's Euthyphro dilemma. On the reverse side, I then gave several examples from the history of philosophy of how both humanist and non-humanist philosophers ground objectivity in ethics in the notion of impartiality. I ended with how religions, when they are at their noblest, implore us to adopt this universalist ethos with its impartial regard for all. Now, here are the references for my talk. I encourage you to check out my original essay, which is at the top of the list. And then the second one is a reply to critics. The first two chapters of Peter Singer's book, Practical Ethics, also explain in plain language this view of objectivity in ethics as impartiality of judgment. And the Peter Singer book is down the bottom. My contact details are there and my web presence and social media presence. If you want to contact me, once again, this will be in the slides. And the contact details, web presence, social media presence of Humanists Australia is there. If you are humanistically inclined, I do encourage you to get on to the, I think it's humanistaustralia.org/support. Get onto the support page and either join or make a donation.